Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're heading back in time to explore the world of ancient magic and religion.
Ooh, sounds intriguing.
Oh, it is. And to guide us on this journey, we have the incredible work of James George Frazer and his classic book, The Golden Bough.
Ah, the Golden Bough, a true masterpiece. It's amazing how Fraser takes us from ancient Rome to indigenous tribes all across the globe, weaving this intricate tapestry of beliefs and practices.
It really is. And what's so fascinating is how he reveals just how much our ancestors relied on magic to understand and shape the world around them.
Yeah.
It's easy to think of magic as something out of fairy tales, but in ancient times it was a very real and powerful force.
Absolutely. I mean, for them, magic wasn't just about spells and potions. It was a way of life.
Yeah.
It was about connecting with the unseen forces of nature and trying to influence them for good or for ill.
Okay, so let's dive right into this idea of sympathetic magic. What exactly is it?
Well, at its core, sympathetic magic is based on this idea that there's a hidden connection between things, a kind of underlying principle of similarity and contact. Similarity and contact. Now, those sound like some pretty key concepts.
They are, Fraser breaks it down like this. He calls it the law of similarity and the law of contact. The law of similarity suggests that like people produces like PC. So if a hunter wants his spear to strike true, he might carry a charm that resembles a spear or an animal known for its accuracy. You see the connection.
So it's almost like a form of mimicry, like you're trying to influence the outcome by imitating it.
Precisely. And then there's the law of contact, which states that things that have been in contact continue to influence each other even after they're separated. This explains why things like hair and nails were treated with such caution in many cultures, because they were believed to retain a connection to the person and could be used in harmful magic.
That's fascinating. It really makes you think about how our modern day anxieties about identity theft might have some distant echo in these ancient beliefs. I mean, imagine if someone could steal your hair and use it to control you.
Oh, it's not that far-fetched.
Yeah.
In fact, Fraser gives several examples of this belief from cultures around the world. There's a very real fear for them. But what I find even more intriguing is how Fraser suggests that magic actually evolved into religion.
That's an interesting thought. So how did that happen?
Well, think about it. As people experimented with magic, they probably started to realize that it didn't always work the way they expected. They couldn't always control the forces of nature, no matter how hard they tried.
Right, so what did they do?
Well, they started to envision more powerful beings, gods who could control those forces, gods who embodied the power of magic, but also had the authority of rulers.
So it's like they needed to create something bigger than themselves, something with even more power to explain the things they couldn't control on their own.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this brings us to the fascinating concept of the divine king, a figure who was seen as both a ruler and a god.
Ooh. Like the pharaohs of ancient Egypt.
Right, precisely. The pharaohs were believed to be the embodiment of gods, like the sun god Ra, and their well-being was literally believed to be intertwined with the fate of their people and the land itself.
That's a lot of pressure to put on one person. I mean, imagine believing that the success of your crops depended on the health of your king.
Oh, is a heavy burden to bear.
Yeah.
And it led to some pretty extreme practices, like the ritual regicide we talked about earlier, where kings were killed to ensure the continued vitality of the land.
Yeah, that one's still hard for me to wrap my head around. I mean, I get the logic behind it, but it's just so brutal.
It is. But you have to remember that for these ancient societies, the king wasn't just a political figure. He was a symbol of the life force itself, and his death was seen as a necessary sacrifice to renew that force.
Okay, but did every society go to such extremes? Or were there other ways they tried to protect the king and ensure his well-being?
Well, Fraser describes a whole range of beliefs and practices that were designed to safeguard the king and maintain his vitality. And one of the most fascinating examples is the figure of the king of the wood at Nimi.
The king of the wood? What's that all about?
So imagine this. There's this sacred grove at Nimi in ancient Italy, and at the center of this grove is a sacred oak tree. Now, guarding this tree is a priest king known as the king of the wood, and his life is bound to the fate of that tree.
Wow, that sounds intense. So what happens to him?
Well, the king of the wood knows that he will eventually be challenged and killed by the successor.
Wait, so he's constantly living under threat of death?
Exactly. Fraser even suggests that this might be a relic of a time when kingship was an athletic prize won in a contest of strength.
Wow, that's a far cry from our modern elections. But you know what else I find fascinating? This whole idea of names having magical power. It sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel.
Oh, and it's a recurring theme in Fraser's work. And it's not just fantasy. In many ancient cultures, names were believed to be an integral part of a person's being. And knowing someone's true name could give you power over them.
I've heard of that in mythology, like that story about the goddess who tricked a god into revealing his secret name.
You're thinking of the Egyptian goddess Isis and the sun god Ra. That's a classic example of how words themselves were believed to hold magical significance.
So if names were so powerful, how did people protect themselves? Did they just go by nicknames to throw off the evil sorcerers?
Well, that's one way they did it.
Right.
Frazer talks about the use of strong names or titles as substitutes to protect their true vulnerable names. And in some cultures, they even went as far as abolishing a king's name upon death, especially if it referred to an animal, to prevent any lingering connection and potential harm from the deceased.
Wow, talk about high stakes.
Yeah.
So a name change wasn't just about rebranding, it was about spiritual safety. This is incredible. There's just so much more to uncover in Frazer's work.
Absolutely. We've only just scratched the surface of the complex tapestry of beliefs that shaped ancient societies. And in our next segment, we'll delve even deeper into the Golden Bough, exploring the fascinating world of taboos, rituals, and the intricate relationship between ancient people and the natural world.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Golden Bough. Last time we were talking about how ancient people really believed in the strong connection between the king and the land. Like their fates were intertwined.
Yeah, it's a concept that comes up again and again in Frazer's work, this idea that the king's well-being was directly linked to the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the people.
Right. And we touched on some pretty intense practices like ritual regicide, where kings were killed to make sure the land stayed fertile. But were there any other less drastic ways they tried to protect the king and make sure he stayed healthy and strong?
Oh, absolutely. Frazer describes a whole system of taboos and rituals that were designed to safeguard the king and maintain his vitality. These taboos were all about protecting the sacred and maintaining a kind of cosmic order.
Taboos, so basically things the king couldn't do, right?
Exactly. Certain actions, foods, objects, even places that were off limits for the king because they were believed to be dangerous or could disrupt that delicate balance between the human and the supernatural world.
So what kind of things were taboo?
Well, there were taboos around pretty much every aspect of life, but some common ones involved hunting and warfare.
Hunting and warfare. What's so taboo about that?
Well, the belief was that when you killed something, whether it was an animal or an enemy, you absorbed some of its essence, and that essence could be dangerous.
Oh, I see. So it's like a spiritual contamination.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You had to be purified after killing to cleanse yourself of that negative energy. And these taboos extended to all sorts of things. Frazer gives some really interesting examples of taboos surrounding hair and nails.
Hair and nails. What's so special about those?
And remember the law of contact we talked about earlier, how things that have been in contact continue to influence each other, even after they're separated.
Right. So hair and nails, since they were once part of the body, were still seen as connected to the person.
Precisely. And they could be used in harmful magic if they fell into the wrong hands.
Wow. So people had to be really careful about what they did with their clippings.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Serious business. And it wasn't just hair and nails. Frazer also talks about the magical significance of knots and rings.
Knots. Like tying your shoes. How could that be magical?
Well, it all comes down to this idea of binding and constriction. A knot could be used to trap a soul, prevent it from leaving the body, or even to bind someone's will make them vulnerable to magical attack.
Seriously. So knots were basically like magical handcuffs.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And rings, with their circular shape, were often seen as symbols of protection, keeping evil spirits at bay. But they could also be used to bind a person to a specific power or entity.
So basically, everyday objects could be imbued with magical significance. It's like the whole world was enchanted.
That's a great way to put it. And this brings us back to the idea of sympathetic magic. You know how we talked about it being used in hunting and warfare? Well, Frazer shows us how it was also applied to the natural world, to influence the weather and ensure bountiful harvests.
Ooh, like rain dances and fertility rituals.
Right, it's exactly. Frazer gives some fascinating examples of rain-making ceremonies from cultures all over the world. These rituals often involved imitation and symbolism. Like the Omaha Indians had this rain dance where they would mimic the falling rain with water.
So it's like they were trying to show the rain how to do it, like a magical instruction manual.
In a way, yes. And there were also ceremonies aimed at ensuring the revival of nature in spring, like the driving out of death and the bringing in of the May tree. These were all about banishing the old, celebrating the new, and making sure the cycle of life kept going.
It's amazing how these ancient rituals reflect this deep desire for renewal and continuity. Like they knew their survival depended on the rhythms of nature, and they were doing everything they could to keep those rhythms going.
That's a really insightful point. They saw themselves as part of the natural world, not separate from it. and their rituals and beliefs reflect that deep connection.
You know what strikes me is how much creativity and ingenuity went into these rituals. It wasn't just about blind faith. They were using their imaginations and their knowledge of the world to try to make things happen.
That's such a great observation. Yeah, it really highlights something important about Frazer's work. He doesn't dismiss these beliefs as primitive superstition. He helps us understand the logic behind them, the way they reflected the human desire to understand and influence the world.
So even though these ancient beliefs might seem strange to us today, we can still appreciate the ingenuity and the depth of thought that went into them.
Absolutely. And they remind us that we're not so different from our ancestors. Even if our way of making sense of the world has changed the underlying human need to believe, to find meaning in the face of the unknown that hasn't gone away.
That's a powerful thought. And it makes me wonder if there are any remnants of these ancient beliefs still lingering in our own modern world. Maybe we haven't completely left magic behind after all.
Perhaps not. We'll explore that idea further in our next segment as we wrap up our deep dive into the Golden Bough. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Golden Bough. We've been exploring this fascinating world of ancient magic and religion, and I have to say, it's really making me rethink some of my assumptions about how our ancestors saw the world.
It's definitely a challenge to our modern perspective, isn't it? But that's what makes Frazer's work so valuable. He doesn't just present these beliefs as a collection of strange superstitions. He helps us understand the logic behind them, the way they reflect the human need to make sense of the unknown.
Right, and one of the things we've been talking about is this idea of the divine king, and how his fate was often seen as intertwined with the fate of the land itself.
Exactly. And, the King of the Wood, with his life bound to that sacred oak tree, he's such a vivid example of that belief. I mean, it's a pretty radical concept, this idea that you have to kill the king to ensure the well-being of everyone else.
Yeah, it's definitely not something you see in our modern political systems. But I'm curious, did Frazer offer any insights into why this belief was so widespread? Like, what was the underlying thinking there?
Well, he suggests that the King of the Wood wasn't just seen as a political ruler. He was a symbol of the life force itself, the vitality of nature. So his death wasn't just an act of violence, it was a ritual sacrifice, a way of renewing that life force, ensuring the continued fertility of the land.
So it's like they believed that by transferring his power to a successor while he was still in his prime, they could prevent that vital energy from fading away.
Exactly. And Frazer points to similar practices in cultures all over the world, suggesting that this belief in the king's connection to the land and the need to ritually renew his power, it was a really fundamental aspect of many ancient societies.
It's amazing to think how these beliefs shapes their entire worldview. It's so different from how we see things today.
Absolutely. But it reminds us that what seems strange or even barbaric to us might have been seen as a sacred duty to them.
And it makes you wonder, are there any echoes of these beliefs in our own modern world? I mean, we might not have Kings of the Wood anymore, but do we still have these underlying anxieties about the forces we can't control?
I think that's a great question. And Frazer's work gives us a framework for understanding those anxieties. Remember how we talked about the power of names in magic? How knowing someone's true name could give you power over them.
Yeah, it's like a magical form of identity theft. Did Frazer give any specific examples of how this belief played out in everyday life?
Well, he talks about how the names of rulers and gods were especially guarded because they were seen as containing the essence of their power. Revealing those names could be incredibly dangerous.
That makes sense. But what about ordinary people? Did they worry about their names being stolen or used against them?
Oh, absolutely. Frazer describes how people would use nicknames or strong names to protect their true names. And in some cultures, they even went as far as abolishing a person's name after they died to prevent their spirit from being summoned or disturbed.
Wow, so it wasn't just about respecting the dead, it was also about protecting the living.
Exactly. It shows how seriously they took the power of words. Language wasn't just a means of communication, it was a force to be reckoned with.
And as we've been going through all of this, it's really made me think about how our relationship with the unseen world has changed over time. We might not believe in magic in the same way that our ancestors did, but we still have our rituals, our superstitions, our ways of trying to find meaning in the face of the unknown.
That's such an important point. Frazer's work shows us that the human need to believe, to find explanations for the things we can't understand, it's a fundamental part of what makes us human.
And maybe that's the most enduring legacy of the Golden Bough. It's not just a study of ancient beliefs, it's a reflection on the enduring human search for meaning and connection in a world full of mystery and wonder.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It encourages us to look at our own beliefs and practices, even the ones that seem rational and modern, and to see how they might be connected to the magical thinking of our ancestors.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the Golden Bough. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And to all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.